On the morning of February 24th, 2023, a young woman waited in a parked car outside a quiet home in Herndon, Virginia. A 4-year-old girl sat beside her. Inside the house, a man was getting ready for a visitor he had been planning for weeks. That visitor believed he was walking into a private fantasy. What he was actually walking into was a trap built by 2 people who claimed to love the woman who lived there. Within the hour, 2 people would be dead.
He dropped the knife and he was saying, I'm gonna kill her. And I don't know, he started stabbing her. I think Brendan shot him, and he asked me help to shot him too because...
And a story would begin that investigators would later call one of the most calculated murder plots they had ever seen. Police who first arrived at the scene were told a simple story.
So somebody's outside.
Someone's outside in the back?
In the back?
A husband had come home to find an intruder attacking his wife, and he had done what any husband might do. It would take months of digging through phones, bank records, and hardware store receipts before investigators understood that almost nothing about that story was true.
He called me and he told me that my son had been killed. And I just know when he told me that I could hear my own voice screaming.
What they eventually uncovered was a plan that had been built slowly, piece by piece, inside a house that looked like every other house on the street. Brendan Banfield was 37 years old. She worked as a pediatric intensive care nurse, spending her days caring for some of the sickest children in the hospital. Co-workers described her as warm, patient, and endlessly kind, the kind of nurse who remembered small details about her patients and made frightened families feel safe.
She was actually a pediatric ICU nurse, so caring for kids was quite literally her life's work. She was also a frontline worker during the height of the COVID pandemic.
At home, she was raising a young daughter with her husband, Brendan, and by most outward appearances, their life in Herndon looked like a quiet, suburban success story. They had a nice house, stable careers, and a small child who filled their days with school runs and weekend routines. Christine's family later described her as someone who gave everything to the people she loved, often putting her own needs last. Her husband, Brendan Banfield, was 40 years old and worked as a criminal investigator for the Internal Revenue Service. It was a role built on trust, the kind of job where a person spends their career looking for lies hidden inside numbers and paperwork.
So who is Brendan? Well, in addition to being Christine's husband, he was a federal agent working as a criminal investigative agent for the IRS.
To neighbors, Brendan seemed steady and unremarkable in the best possible way. He had a badge, a mortgage, and a daughter he was raising alongside his wife. Nothing about his public life suggested the kind of person capable of planning what would happen inside his own home. By the time of the murders, Christine and Brendan had been married for several years and had built a life that, from the outside, checked every box people associate with stability. 2 working professionals, a comfortable home in a good school district, a young daughter who split her time between daycare and evenings with both parents. Friends of the couple later described a marriage that seemed steady, if unremarkable, the kind of relationship that blends quietly into a neighborhood rather than standing out from it. There was no public history of conflict, no restraining orders, no warning signs that neighbors could point back to once the truth came out. Whatever was happening inside that house was happening far below the surface that everyone else could see. In 2021, the Banfields hired a young woman from Brazil to help care for their daughter. Her name was Juliana Peres Magalhaes. She was 21 years old when she moved in as the family's au pair, living under their roof and quickly becoming part of their daily routine.
Okay, so you live here?
I'm an au pair.
You're an au pair? Okay.
She picked the child up from activities, helped around the house, and spent long hours alongside both Christine and Brendan. For a while, everything about the arrangement looked completely normal. Families hire au pair every year, and most of those relationships stay exactly what they are supposed to be. By all early accounts, Juliana settled into the household easily. She was described as hardworking and dependable, someone the family trusted enough to leave alone with their daughter for hours at a time. She lived under their roof, ate meals with them, and became a familiar presence in the small, ordinary moments that make up a family's daily life. That closeness, the kind built into almost every live-in childcare arrangement, is exactly what made what happened next so difficult for people around the family to accept once it became public. This one did not. By August of 2022, Brendan and Juliana had begun a secret relationship. What started as stolen moments inside the house where Juliana worked slowly grew into something neither of them was willing to give up. According to testimony given later in court, Brendan told Juliana he wanted to marry her and have children of his own with her.
Did he ever talk about the two of you getting married or the two of you having children?
Yes.
But there was a problem standing in the way of that future. He was still married to Christine, and by his own account, he did not want a divorce. A split would have meant losing a large share of his finances, and it likely would have meant a custody battle over their daughter. Divorce was slow, expensive, and uncertain.
He basically said divorce was not an option.
Did he say why?
Money was involved.
Whatever Brendan wanted instead, it was not that. What prosecutors say he chose instead was a plan so elaborate it would take investigators months to fully untangle. Sometime before February 2023, Brendan allegedly created a fake profile on FetLife, a website built around alternative sexual interests and fetish communities.
Brendan created a FetLife account. If you're not familiar with it, it's a social networking app for people interested in fetishes, sexual kink. He posted as Christine.
He built the profile to look like it belonged to his wife Christine, using her name and, according to prosecutors, crafting a persona that did not reflect who she actually was in real life. Posing as Christine online, he began reaching out to strangers, describing a very specific and dangerous fantasy, one involving a staged home invasion. He was not looking for a real connection. He was looking for someone to walk into his home at a very particular time, believing he had been invited there for something consensual. That person turned out to be Joseph Ryan, a 39-year-old man with no connection to the Banfield family whatsoever. Joseph was described by the people who loved him as a devoted son, nephew, and grandson, someone with an entire life and future ahead of him that had nothing to do with the Banfield's marriage or the plan Brendan had spent months building. He was, by every account given after his death, simply someone looking for a connection online, unaware that the profile messaging him was not who it claimed to be. Investigators say the messages instructed him on what to expect and told him not to stop, even if the woman inside the house screamed. Joseph had no idea he was being cast as a character in someone else's plan. He was a stranger being lured toward his own death, chosen not because of anything he had done, but simply because he answered a message. On the morning of February 24th, Joseph stopped briefly at a Walmart before making his way toward the Banfield home. Records later showed the exact time, just after 7 in the morning. He had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. Meanwhile, Brendan was positioned nearby at a McDonald's, waiting. Juliana sat in a car outside the house with the 4-year-old daughter, watching for Joseph to arrive. When his car finally pulled up, she made a phone call to Brendan. The plan, months in the making, was now moving into its final stage. According to Juliana's later testimony, once Joseph arrived, she and Brendan brought the little girl into the house and down to the basement, keeping her away from what was about to happen upstairs. Then the two of them made their way to the bedroom, where Joseph was waiting, believing he was about to take part in the scenario he had been promised. Instead, prosecutors say Brendan shot him. Christine, prosecutors allege, was then stabbed by her own husband, using the knife that Joseph had brought with him, a knife meant to be a prop in a fantasy that was never real to begin with. When Juliana saw Joseph still moving, she fired a second shot, ending his life completely.
She yelled back at Brendan, saying, "Brendan, he has a knife." That's when Brendan first shot Joe. I was able to see him stabbing her.
What happened next, according to prosecutors, was not panic. It was performance. The two of them are said to have staged the bedroom to look like the scene of a break-in gone wrong, positioning the bodies and their evidence to suggest that Brendan had walked in on a violent home invasion and defended his family. A frantic call was placed to 911. When police arrived, they found no signs of forced entry anywhere in the house. Christine Banfield had suffered multiple stab wounds. Joseph Ryan was dead from gunshot wounds. The couple's young daughter was found safe in the basement, unaware of what had just happened one floor above her. At first, the story Brendan and Juliana gave police seemed to explain the horror investigators were looking at. They said Joseph Ryan had broken into the home and attacked Christine with a knife, and that Brendan and Juliana had shot him in self-defense while trying to protect her. It was tragic, but on the surface, it made a kind of sense. A husband walks in on an attack. He does what he has to do. For a while, that narrative held. The initial 911 call itself came from Juliana, not Brendan, her voice frantic as she reported that something terrible had happened inside the home. Officers arriving on scene found a chaotic picture: 2 bodies, a young child unharmed downstairs, and 2 adults who appeared to be in genuine shock. In the immediate confusion of those first hours, first responders had little reason to treat the 2 survivors as suspects rather than victims. It is often in these early hours, before evidence has been carefully mapped and timelines cross-checked, that a well-rehearsed story has its best chance of being believed. But investigators do not stop at the first explanation, especially when 2 people are dead, and the story keeps shifting in small, uncomfortable ways. Detectives began pulling apart the physical evidence, and very little of it lined up cleanly with what they had been told. There were no signs that anyone had broken into the home. If Joseph Ryan truly forced his way inside, there should have been a broken lock, a shattered window, some sign of entry. There was none. Digital evidence became the next thread investigators pulled. The FetLife account used to lure Joseph Ryan to the house became a central piece of the puzzle, and it was not simple. In an unexpected twist, the prosecution's own forensic expert initially suggested that Christine's account activity appeared consistent with Christine controlling it herself, not her husband. That detail alone would later give Brendan's defense team something to point to during trial, a genuine crack that investigators had to work hard to explain. Even so, the deeper investigators went, the more the picture around Brendan began to shift. Months after the murders, detectives noted strange details inside the home. New flooring had been installed. New furniture had appeared. Photographs of Brendan and Juliana together were later found displayed inside the same master bedroom where the killings had taken place. A salesman who had sold the family upgraded windows months before the murders recalled it being an unusual request. Triple pane glass, the kind normally chosen for extra soundproofing rather than energy savings. Investigators would later suggest this timing was not a coincidence. Financial and purchase records added more weight to the case. About a month before the murders, Brendan had purchased a handgun, a Glock 43X. Forensic testing on his clothing turned up something else. Christine's DNA was found on his jeans. When his hands were tested, however, investigators found no blood, though experts explained that washing hands thoroughly can remove that kind of evidence entirely. None of these details alone proved a murder plot. Together, they began forming a pattern that was very hard to ignore. The most significant break in the case came from inside the relationship at the center of it all. For 8 months after the killings, the investigation continued without an arrest. Detectives spent that time quietly building their case, aware that a single misstep could allow 2 people to walk away from a double homicide, with a story that, while full of holes, had never fully collapsed. Then, in October of 2023, Juliana Peres Magalhaes was taken into custody and charged with second-degree murder and weapons offenses connected to Joseph Ryan's death. Facing the weight of those charges and the very real possibility of spending decades behind bars, she eventually made a decision that would shape the entire case moving forward. In October of 2024, roughly a year after her arrest, she pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter in Joseph's death. As part of her plea agreement, she agreed to cooperate fully with prosecutors and testify against Brendan Banfield in exchange for a recommended sentence of time served, a deal that essentially asked her to trade her own silence for a chance at freedom. When Brendan Banfield's trial finally began, in January of 2026, Juliana's testimony became the backbone of the prosecution's case. She told the court, in detail, about the affair, about Brendan's plan, and about what happened inside that bedroom. She said he had told her he wanted to marry her and start a family together, but that he needed to, in his words, get rid of his wife first. She testified that divorcing Christine would have cost him financially and put his custody of their daughter at risk. She described helping create the fake online profile, waiting outside with the little girl on the morning of the murders, and watching Brendan attack his wife before firing the second shot into Joseph Ryan herself when she saw him still moving. Brendan's defense team did not have an easy task. Their strategy focused less on offering an alternative story and more on attacking the credibility of the case built against him. They argued that Juliana Peres Magalhaes could not be trusted, pointing to the earlier forensic finding that suggested Christine herself may have controlled the fetish website account. They suggested investigators had developed tunnel vision, locking onto Brendan as their suspect too early and interpreting every piece of evidence to fit that theory. They brought in their own experts to challenge the prosecution's account of the blood spatter inside the bedroom, hoping to plant enough doubt that jurors would hesitate. One especially emotional moment came when body cam footage was played for the jury, capturing Brendan breaking down inside an ambulance in the immediate aftermath of the killings, and later reacting in real time as a doctor told him his wife had died.
Hi, sir. My name is Gina. I'm one of the doctors here. Your wife has died.
His defense hoped that raw, unscripted grief would be difficult for jurors to reconcile with the image of a calculated killer. When Brendan eventually took the stand in his own defense, he told the court that no reasonable person would kill over what he described as a brief 6-week affair, minimizing the length and depth of the relationship prosecutors said had driven the entire plot. Prosecutors, for their part, spent days walking the jury through the physical layout of the crime scene, alongside crime scene analysts and firearms experts. They laid out the timeline hour by hour, from the Walmart stop captured on camera to the final moments inside the bedroom, asking jurors to consider how many of those details could realistically be explained by a stranger breaking in off the street. They reminded the jury that no matter how the relationships were framed, 2 people were dead, one of them a complete stranger to the household, and someone had taken very deliberate steps to make that look like an accident of fate rather than a plan. The defense's approach, however, ran into a familiar problem. They spent much of the trial explaining what they believed did not happen, without ever offering the jury a full, coherent story of what did. They challenged the state's witnesses. They challenged the forensic timeline. They challenged Juliana's motives for cooperating. But they never gave jurors a competing narrative to hold onto, and in a case built on 2 dead bodies and a staged crime scene, an absence of explanation can be just as damaging as a weak one. After weeks of testimony, the jury reached its decision. On February 2nd, 2026, Brendan Banfield was found guilty on 2 counts of aggravated murder, one for the death of his wife Christine, and one for the death of Joseph Ryan. Under Virginia law, a conviction for aggravated murder carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison. There was no room for negotiation in the punishment itself, only in how the judge chose to speak about what he had done. At sentencing, the presiding judge did not hold back. She described Brendan's actions as evil and deeply calculated, pointing not just to the murders themselves, but to everything that came after: the staging, the lies to police, and the fact that a 4-year-old girl had been sitting in a basement while her mother was killed 1 floor above her. She told the courtroom that Brendan had shown no regard for his wife's life or for the innocent stranger he and Juliana had lured into their trap. Joseph Ryan, she noted, had no connection to this family at all. He was, in every sense, a beloved son and a completely unwitting victim, pulled into a plot that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with 2 people who wanted him gone. Just over a week later, on February 13th, 2026, Juliana Peres Magalhaes returned to court for her own sentencing. Her plea deal had recommended time served, largely in recognition of her cooperation and testimony against Brendan. But the judge overseeing her case was not willing to accept that recommendation. She described the crime as the most serious manslaughter scenario the court had ever handled and pointed to the many opportunities Juliana had to walk away before the murders took place. Opportunities she did not take. In the end, Juliana was sentenced to the maximum 10 years allowed under the manslaughter charge, well beyond what her plea agreement had asked for. Before her sentence was handed down, Juliana spoke briefly to the court. She apologized to the families of both victims, telling the judge that she had lost herself inside a relationship and left her own values behind.
I pray for forgiveness from the Benson family and from Joseph Ryan's family and from Valerie. I will never forgive myself for the pain caused.
She said she understood she was to blame and that she hoped she could eventually be forgiven, though she acknowledged that forgiveness was not something she could demand from anyone. For Joseph Ryan's family, those words offered little comfort. His aunt told the court that Brendan had not simply taken Joseph and Christine from the people who loved them. He had tried to erase the truth of who they really were, reducing 2 real people with real lives into props inside his own plan to escape a marriage he no longer wanted. What makes this case difficult to sit with is not just the violence of it, but the ordinary shape everything wore right up until the moment it wasn't ordinary at all. A husband, a wife, a young daughter, a trusted caregiver living under their roof. On paper, nothing about the Banfield household looked like the setting for a double murder. That is often the most unsettling part of cases like this one. The plotting did not happen in the shadows of some obviously broken home. It happened behind a normal front door, in a quiet neighborhood, built slowly over months by two people who were trusted by everyone around them, including, in the end, by the man who never made it out of that bedroom alive. Christine Banfield spent her career caring for other people's children while raising one of her own. Joseph Ryan was a stranger who trusted a message from someone he believed wanted to meet him. Neither of them did anything to deserve what happened inside that house on February 24th, 2023. What remains now is a young girl growing up without her mother, two families left to make sense of an unimaginable betrayal, and a case that investigators say stands as one of the most calculated and cold-blooded plots they have ever worked. For the families still living with what happened, the legal outcome brings a kind of closure, but not the kind that undoes anything. Brendan Banfield will spend the rest of his life in prison. Juliana Peres Magalhaes will spend up to a decade there as well, having traded her freedom in exchange for the truth she eventually chose to tell. Christine's family and Joseph's family were never connected before that February morning. Two households with no reason to know each other, now bound together forever by a plan that treated both of their loved ones as expendable. Cases like this one tend to stay with people long after the headlines fade, not because of the violence itself, but because of how ordinary everything looked, right up until it wasn't.